This is really a fascinating lesson in the patients that we need in clinical research to really understand the impact. Because, look, CheckMate 214 was an immediate splash in the field. It was really the first study to show against the standard of care at the time, sunitinib, a really kind of across the board benefit for the intermediate poor risk patient population in terms of overall survival, both intermediate and poor risk. And the study was set up kind of a little bit unusual. It was based on some early phase 2 data to suggest that this regimen might work, better in the higher risk populations. So even though it accrued all comers, including favorable risk patients, the primary analysis was focused on the intermediate and poor risk population. But the secondary analyses looked at the response, progression-free survival, and overall survival for the intention to treat population, all comers. And up until this point, we had primarily done studies in all comers. This idea of focusing on sort of IMDC risk groups was still relatively new. And the study was positive for both the intermediate poor risk as well as for the intention to treat populations. But because that was a secondary endpoint, the approval for ipilimumab, nivolumab was really focused on the intermediate and poor risk populations. So, we fast forward now to 8 years. And you might ask, why are we still following this study? This regimen has been FDA approved, the papers have been published. But the truth of the matter is that there's a tail to this curve that was not necessarily anticipated. And what's really fascinating, what we saw at ASCO this year, GU ASCO this year, was that tail has continued, and we're seeing it in both the progression-free survival. So there's a fairly, consistent median progression-free survival, around 8 months or so. But the tail, about 20 to 30% of patients not progressing now, has continued out with this median follow-up, as you heard, about 8 years. And we're seeing that in both the intermediate poor risk as well as the overall intention to treat population. And it's becoming more and more distinct from the natural history with sunitinib. We just seeing those patients, very few, less than 5%, that are long-term progression-free survivors with sunitinib. So we're seeing this change. This is not the natural history of the disease. We've really changed it. And what's fascinating is we're seeing it now also in the favorable risk group. So even though this was an exploratory group, the favorable risk alone, and even though the initial data suggested that these patients progressed faster than the patients receiving sunitinib, there's a switch in the curve. And the curve changes so that the progression-free survivals are greater at 5 years and now 8 years than with the ipilimumab nivolumab combination than with sunitinib. And actually, if we look at the overall survival for favorable risk, it's actually trending in favor of ipi-nivo with a hazard ratio of 0.94. Not overly impressive, but when you consider nothing has really shown a survival benefit in this population, and consider this this subgroup of long-term non-progressors, it suddenly becomes, kind of an attractive regimen for that. And when we look at the overall intention to treat population, if that were the primary analysis, it would be a no-brainer to approve this regimen for all comers. So to me, it really kind of questions, when do we revisit our FDA labels? When do we really evaluate the data for what it is? And it's all prospective data. It's all statistically robust, whether it was primary or secondary. And to me, it really legitimizes the rationale for using, ipilimumab, nivolumab, regardless of what risk group you're in. I think we should consider ipi-nivo regardless of risk group. But what this doesn't tell us is how does ipi-nivo compare to an IO-TKI regimen. This was compared against sunitinib alone. But recognizing that the toxicities are different. The toxicities of a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, especially chronically, is different than the toxicities of a ipilimumab nivolumab combination. We can take now the side effect profile and the quality of life associated with long-term treatment on these regimens into account if we've got, relatively equivalent long-term outcome data, survival data for this approach. And recognize that particularly when we're talking about favorable risk patients, these are patients that have traditionally more low volume disease, patients that have slower progressive disease to metastasis. This is the population of patients that are going to receive potentially and likely multiple lines of therapy. So it's not necessarily an either or, it's a matter of order. And the issue with ipilimumab, nivolumab is that it's really only approved for those agents, particularly ipilimumab, in the frontline setting. Now, we will have some interesting data, the CheckMate 8Y8 data, to see just how important is ipilimumab in that frontline setting, where we'll compare ipilimumab, nivolumab versus nivolumab alone. And I think those will be important studies to read out and ultimately help guide just how much are we missing if we skip the ipilimumab and go right into an IO-TKI regimen, and recognize that we have indications for tyrosine kinase inhibitors in the refractory setting, and novel combinations are still being studied in that setting with other immunotherapies, but until they're approved, our current treatment right now only allows us ipilimumab up front. So if we think there's a population of patients that are really benefiting from that combination up front, and we think that the quality of life long-term for any particular patient might be more favorable with that combination versus a TKI, that's where it becomes attractive. But it's not head-to-head data, and we're limited by that. I think all of these regimens can be used in the favorable setting, successfully. But these are the kinds of things we'll take into account when we're dealing with patients that aren't represented traditionally in these studies. Our elderly patients, our patients with renal failure, or our patients that have performance status declines or heart failure, other things that might complicate the use of our traditional IO-TKI combinations. And so this is where I think having flexibility, having the availability of different approaches, is really a benefit to the field.